In the bustling city of Laketown, there lived a wealthy man named Mr. Johnson. He was a respected businessman who owned many shops and properties across the city. Mr. Johnson had two sons, James, the eldest, and Daniel, the youngest. James was a tall, strong, and serious young man who worked tirelessly to help his father with the family business. He was responsible, quiet, and often kept to himself. Daniel, on the other hand, was lively, charming, and full of life. He was always surrounded by friends, and everyone loved his company. Mr. Johnson adored Daniel. He would often say, "Daniel is my joy, my shining star." He gave him the best clothes, sent him to the finest schools, and always spoke proudly of him to his friends. James, however, was treated differently. Though he worked hard and never complained, he was often overlooked by his father. The people of Laketown noticed Mr. Johnson's favoritism. They would gossip about how he seemed to love Daniel more than James. "It's a shame," they would say. "James is the one who takes care of everything, but it's Daniel who gets all the praise." James heard these whispers, and though he never spoke of it, it hurt him deeply. He loved his father and brother, but he couldn't understand why he wasn't loved the same way. The gossip in Laketown grew louder as the years went by. In the markets, at the church, and even in the parks, people would talk about the Johnson family. "It's strange how Mr. Johnson favors Daniel," said one old woman to another. "James is the one who does all the work, yet Daniel is the one who gets all the love." "Yes," the other woman agreed, "James is such a good son. He's always working hard, always so responsible. But Mr. Johnson barely notices him." Daniel, who was loved by everyone, enjoyed the attention he received. He didn't think much about the gossip. After all, he believed his father's love was natural, something he deserved. He never realized how deeply it hurt James to hear these things. James, on the other hand, buried his feelings. He focused on his work, trying to earn his father's love through dedication and hard work. But no matter what he did, it never seemed to be enough. As time went on, the divide between the two brothers grew. Daniel continued to enjoy his life, going to parties, making new friends, and living comfortably. Mr. Johnson continued to shower him with gifts and praise, telling everyone how proud he was of his youngest son. James, however, grew more distant. He threw himself into the family business, taking on more responsibilities and working long hours. He was the one who made sure everything ran smoothly, from the shops to the properties, but his efforts went unnoticed by his father. The people of Laketown saw the divide and shook their heads. "It's not fair," they would say. "James is the one who deserves the praise. He's the one who's always there, always working, but his father doesn't see it." The gossip made its way back to Mr. Johnson, but he dismissed it. "People will always talk," he said, "but I know what's best for my sons." He continued to favor Daniel, blind to the growing pain in James's heart. One day, a man named Mr. Lucas, who was known for his cunning and deceit, approached Daniel. He had heard about Mr. Johnson's wealth and saw an opportunity to use Daniel's charm for his own gain. Mr. Lucas began to flatter Daniel, telling him how talented and smart he was, and how he could help him become even more successful. Daniel, eager to prove himself outside of his father's shadow, was easily swayed. Mr. Lucas convinced Daniel to invest in a risky business venture, promising great returns. Blinded by ambition, Daniel agreed without consulting his father or brother. Meanwhile, James noticed that something was wrong. The business accounts were showing unusual transactions, and Daniel was often missing from important meetings. When James confronted Daniel, his brother brushed him off, saying, "Don't worry, James, I know what I'm doing." But James couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. As weeks turned into months, Daniel's venture with Mr. Lucas began to fall apart. The business was losing money rapidly, and Daniel found himself in over his head. Despite Mr. Lucas's promises, the investments didn't pay off, and soon Daniel was drowning in debt. Desperate to cover up his mistakes, Daniel started taking money from his father's business accounts. He thought he could fix everything before anyone noticed, but the situation only worsened. The debts grew, and the business began to suffer. James, who had been closely monitoring the finances, quickly realized what was happening. The numbers weren't adding up, and the family business was in danger. He tried to talk to Daniel again, but his brother, embarrassed and scared, avoided him. "Daniel, what is going on?" James finally confronted him one evening. "The business is in trouble, and I know you have been taking money. You need to tell me what's happening." Daniel, his face pale and eyes full of fear, broke down. "I'm sorry, James. I made a huge mistake. I trusted the wrong person, and now everything is falling apart. I didn't want to disappoint Father, so I thought I could fix it on my own." James felt a mix of anger and pity. He wanted to be furious with Daniel, but seeing his brother so scared and vulnerable softened his heart. "We need to tell Father," James said calmly. "He needs to know the truth." James and Daniel went to see their father, Mr. Johnson, together. Their hearts were heavy with guilt and worry. Mr. Johnson was sitting in his study reading the newspaper when they entered. He looked up, surprised to see both his sons standing before him. "Father, we need to talk," James began, trying to keep his voice calm. "There's something you need to know about the business." Mr. Johnson put down his newspaper, his face growing serious. "What is it? Is something wrong?" Daniel stepped forward, his hands shaking. "Father, I made a big mistake. I got involved in a bad deal with a man named Mr. Lucas. I thought I could make a lot of money, but it all went wrong. I started taking money from the business to cover the losses, but now everything is falling apart." Mr. Johnson's face turned pale as he listened. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "How could this happen, Daniel? Why didn't you come to me sooner?" Daniel couldn't meet his father's eyes. "I didn't want to disappoint you, Father. I thought I could fix it myself, but I only made things worse." James stepped in to explain further. He told their father about the financial troubles he had noticed and how he had tried to talk to Daniel earlier. "Father, we need to act fast if we want to save the business," James said, trying to stay strong. Mr. Johnson was heartbroken. His favorite son, the one he had always trusted, had nearly destroyed everything he had worked for. He felt betrayed and deeply saddened. News about the Johnson family's troubles spread quickly in Laketown. People who once admired Mr. Johnson and his family now whispered behind their backs. "Did you hear about Daniel?" one woman said to her friend in the market. "He's the reason their business is in trouble. He got involved with the wrong people." Her friend nodded. "It's a shame. Mr. Johnson always favored Daniel, but it's James who has to clean up the mess." The gossip hurt the Johnson family deeply. Mr. Johnson, who had always been proud and respected, now felt embarrassed and ashamed. He avoided going out in public, not wanting to face the people who were talking about his family. Daniel was overwhelmed with guilt. He stayed away from his usual friends and social gatherings, too ashamed to show his face. He realized that his actions had hurt not just the business, but his family as well. With the business in danger, it was up to James to save it. He worked long hours, doing everything he could to keep the company from collapsing. James knew that if he didn't act quickly, everything their father had built would be lost. Mr. Johnson, still upset by what had happened, couldn't bring himself to go to the office. He felt too ashamed to face his employees and too uncertain to make decisions. He put his trust in James, knowing that his eldest son was the only one who could fix things. James didn't complain about the extra work. He loved his family and was determined to protect their business. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to do whatever it took. The workers in the company began to notice how hard James was working. "James is really stepping up," they would say. "He's the one keeping this place going. If anyone can save the business, it's him." As the days passed, Mr. Johnson started to see things more clearly. He watched James work tirelessly, trying to fix the problems that Daniel had caused. For the first time, he saw just how strong and capable his eldest son was. Mr. Johnson's heart ached as he realized how unfairly he had treated James over the years. He had always been so focused on Daniel's charm and personality that he had overlooked James's hard work and dedication. One evening, Mr. Johnson walked into the office where James was still working late. The room was quiet, except for the sound of papers rustling as James reviewed the accounts. "James," Mr. Johnson said softly, breaking the silence, "I want to thank you for everything you've done. I know I haven't been the father you deserved, and I'm sorry for that." James looked up, surprised to see his father. He could see that his father was sincere, and it touched him deeply. "You don't need to apologize, Father," James replied. "I'm just doing what needs to be done." But Mr. Johnson shook his head. "No, James, you've always been the strong one, the one I could count on, and I didn't see it. I'm proud of you." With Mr. Johnson's support, James continued his work to save the business. Slowly, things began to improve. The debts were paid off, and the company started to recover. Daniel, feeling ashamed of his mistakes, approached James one day. "James, I don't know how to make up for what I've done," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I've been a terrible brother, and I don't deserve your forgiveness." James looked at his brother, seeing how much he had changed. "Daniel, you made a mistake, but you're still my brother," James said kindly. "We're family, and we have to stick together. Just promise me you'll learn from this and do better." Daniel nodded, tears in his eyes. "I promise, James. I'll work hard to earn back your trust and Father's respect." The two brothers hugged, their bond stronger than ever. Despite everything that had happened, they knew they could get through it together. As the business slowly returned to normal, Mr. Johnson made some big decisions. He decided to step back from running the company and officially put James in charge. He knew that his eldest son was the right person to lead the company into the future. Daniel, determined to make up for his mistakes, began working under James's guidance. He was no longer the carefree, irresponsible young man he had once been. The experience had humbled him, and he was ready to prove that he could be a valuable part of the family business. The gossip in Laketown began to die down as people saw the changes in the Johnson family. "James has really turned things around," they would say, "and Daniel seems to have learned his lesson." The Johnson family was no longer a topic of scandal. Instead, they were seen as a family that had faced great challenges and come out stronger. Mr. Johnson felt proud as he watched his sons work together. He had spent so many years focusing on Daniel that he had missed the quiet strength of James. Now he saw both of his sons for who they really were and loved them equally. Dear viewers, what lessons did you take away from this dramatic tale? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.